Welcome to Mainline School Night's monthly show featuring interviews with Mainline School Night instructors. I'm Wendy Greenfield, Executive Director of Mainline School Night, and I'm so excited to be here in the studio in person with one of our fabulous instructors, Greg Frost. Mainline School Night is offering over 450 classes this semester. We've been adding them almost weekly in response to popular demand. Many of them are outdoors now, some on the porch of Kritzburg, and others are adventure classes, hiking classes. So be sure to check our website, mainlineschoolnight.org. So Greg, welcome.
Thanks.
It's great to be here with you today. Gregory Frost is a writing professor at Swarthmore College, and he's also an author of horror and science fiction and fantasy novels and short stories and much more, and has such a fascinating background. I'm really happy to be here with you today and get to know you better.
We'll see if it's fascinating.
I'm sure it is.
Right.
So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your career trajectory.
It had a trajectory.
It may not be a direct line, but it's probably some kind of trajectory.
I'm one of those people that did not start out thinking you want to be a writer. Most people who are professional writers, and I interview them as part of a thing called the Liars Club Oddcast, which is a group of 5 writers who talk to writers. Almost everybody we interview says, at 4 years of age, I knew I wanted to be a writer. This is what I wanted to do. I came out of the womb with a pencil and paper, and I was writing, that kind of thing. Not me. I was an art major, and I took a short story writing class, a night class, my 3rd year in college. And the more I wrote short stories, the less I was painting. So it's sort of like my brain shifted from visual art to the written word. And I changed gears, and so started writing. So I came to it, fairly late in that sense. Most of my high school period, I was drawing comic books. I was a huge comic fan, so I was illustrating my own comic books, but I was also writing them. So I kind of came to realize I wanted to do the writing part, not the illustrating part of that. And anyway, it turned into a career of sorts. And so I shifted gears. I left art school. I took a year off college. I went to enrolled at the University of Iowa because they had a great writing program. Met a lot of amazing people there, like Joe Haldeman, T.C. Boyle, writers like that. Joe Haldeman, who was a science fiction writer himself, had me in a class and said he thought that I should submit a couple of my short stories to a program called Clarion, which is a 6-week immersive writing class in science fiction and fantasy, which at that time was at Michigan State University. And I did, and I got accepted, which was exciting and not necessarily expected. And so I did that course where I worked with 6 different published science fiction writers over a 6-week period. And then went back to Iowa, finished my time at Iowa, and then started trying to sell fiction, and spent the next 6 years trying to sell fiction before I sold a short story. And then after that, it was very strange. After the first story sold, the second story sold very quickly, and so on and so forth. And then I sold a novel about 2 years later, and so forth. So it's interesting that I mentioned Joe Haldeman. One of the things that Joe says as advice to writers is that you only need 3 things in order to write fiction. One is you need talent, and you don't need very much of it. The second thing you need is perseverance, and you need a huge amount of perseverance. And the third thing is luck, and that's just your manuscript hits the editor a certain way, and they like it, and they buy it for their magazine, or same thing with a book publisher, book editor, reads your manuscript and really likes what you're doing and says, I want to work with you. So that's something you can't control. Luck is the one element in that you can't do anything about, but the perseverance and the showing up for the interview part of it is all within your control and makes all the difference.
I would think you'd also need a lot of self-confidence and, sort of a tough skin.
You do need to develop tough skin. I don't know any writers that necessarily have all that much self-confidence. I think we all we all go through these periods of, oh my God, what did I think I was doing with this story, or where did I start, or what do I actually know about this? Mm-hmm. Every writer I've ever talked to, sooner or later, reaches what I'd call the dark night of despair, where you're in the middle of whatever it is you're working on. And you look back at what you've written so far, and it really looks crappy. And you look at what's in front of you, and there isn't anything there because you haven't written it yet. And you just sort of start to lose your nerve. And I think that real writers are the people who at that point say, screw it, I'm pushing on, and do persevere, do keep going. And that's a really important thing for students in writing classes and such to learn too, is that every writer goes through these periods where they don't know where they're going. They don't know what happens next. And I teach my students, or I tell my students at Swarthmore, for instance, that if they're reaching that point, they're behaving like a writer. So they shouldn't be worried about it. That's normal. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. But as far as the thick skin goes, yeah, you have to anticipate, I think, that you're going to get a lot of rejection slips. You're going to collect rejection slips for years. And T.C. Boyle, whom I knew at the University of Iowa, was probably the best person I've ever met at handling that. He took all these rejection slips he'd gotten from various magazines, Atlantic, Esquire, Playboy, all of these places he was submitting fiction. And he made a collage out of them and then hung it on his bedroom wall. So every morning he'd get up and he'd see his rejection slips up on the wall. And it was just sort of like, that diffuses the power that those rejection slips had over him. So it was really, I thought, brilliant. Yeah.
Interesting. I read that you started, or you were also sometimes act in horror films.
I prefer not to talk about that, actually.
I was thinking that because I know that there are actors and actresses who don't read their reviews because they're acting for the craft.
No, this was not acting for the craft. This was acting for another science fiction writer named Samtao Sucharitkul, who had written a horror film called The Laughing Dead, which I'm embarrassed to say is probably available on YouTube if somebody wants to see it. But rather than hiring a lot of actors, he hired his friends who were writers, who of course are idiots. So, it's like, here, we'll give you $1,000, come out here and act in this movie. And of course you're going, okay. So, we went out to Los Angeles and to old Tucson, which burned down shortly after we worked there. But anyway, so we went out to LA and to Tucson, and we made a horror film. I think he made it for all of like $1 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but not in movie terms. And it won awards in Japan and places like that, and I don't know why.
That's great.
It's not something I talk about very much, and it's not something people should seek out unless they're really desperately in need of horrible entertainment. So that's all I can say.
That's great. I'm interested in your experience in teaching adults fiction writing at Mainline School Night, and sort of how that compares to teaching college-age students at Swarthmore.
Well, a lot of the rules are the same. The things that they need to learn, the elements of fiction that I'll talk about are virtually the same probably for adults as they are for college students. But generally speaking, college students in a workshop are students who've already been writing a good deal, and they're 18 to 20, so for them this is just sort of like shifting from what they were doing in high school into writing at a college level. Adults in writing classes like at Mainline School Night are usually people who've been thinking about writing maybe their whole lives. Maybe for 20, 30, 40 years they've been thinking that they wanted to write. And so that's a little bit different. and I kind of treat it as a little bit different. This is their opportunity to strike out and try to do that. And I usually tell the class on the first night that, this is 8 weeks of opportunity to try whatever they want, to, experiment with form, experiment with voice, and to get things wrong, because that's one of the things about writing fiction is you only learn from your mistakes. You learn by getting things wrong. So they kind of have to give themselves permission to get things totally wrong, because nothing happens to you if you do. But so it's a different group, and I think it's a different mindset because they've wanted to, or on some level they think they've wanted to write fiction for a long time.
Interesting. I know that Swarthmore has been teaching and learning primarily on Zoom for the last year.
Yeah.
And I know that, like with mainline school night, Swarthmore had to pivot sort of instantly, especially when the kids when the students were on break.
Right.
And I'm wondering what that experience teaching online has been for you in comparison to teaching in person.
Mainly, I've gotten better at it. It was really being thrown a serious curve, both for the students and I think for the instructors at first. So a lot of things that I would normally have done in a class, I couldn't do. We simply didn't have the time because there's a fatigue factor when you're zooming in that's not there when you're live and in person somehow. So I learned to cut the classes into shorter pieces and to pre-record canned lectures for them rather than trying to deliver those where they're stuck in their bedroom or their dining room or their kitchen, wherever they are, learning at home mostly, and listening to me, natter on for an hour and a half on some topic. That was crazy. So the format had to change really dramatically. But I learned a lot of things from doing that, and one of the things was how to teach via Zoom, so I hope that makes a difference for the class here.
That's great. One last quick question. So,
Sure.
Rumor has it you work out at Soul Cycle sometimes, and I was wondering...
That's where I saw Libby last.
Yes.
Okay, now I understand.
So I was wondering what role fitness plays in your life, and do you think it's important for writers to stay fit?
I think it's a good idea to stay fit, period. I haven't been to Soul Cycle since the pandemic, so it's been a year without that kind of exercise.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which stinks, frankly.
Yes,
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things. I think it feels like I gave up.
Did you get a Peloton or no? Okay.
No, I have a real bicycle. I can go out and bicycle and stuff. But I also go out and walk in the middle of the day quite frequently, and that's, again, kind of useful from a writer's perspective, just to go out and think about whatever you wrote in the morning and throw it around in your head and come back and mess with it in the afternoon. So,
Greg, I've so enjoyed talking to you. I wish we had more time today.
Thanks.
But thank you so much for joining me here today. And
Thanks,
I
Wendy.
hope I get an opportunity to take your class in the future. All right.
Well, thanks.
Thank you so much. All right. Don't forget to visit Mainline School Night's website, mainlineschoolnight.org. There are so many classes to choose from. Pretty much anything you want to take, we offer. And we're adding new classes in response to popular demand every day, including hiking classes and wine tasting classes on the porch. And we'll hear more about those soon. So I am happy to welcome our second guest, Vicki Miller. Vicki is a fabulous wine instructor. She's been teaching for Mainline School Night for a few years, and her classes are always sold out. So you should register soon if you haven't. Vicki, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.
So nice to be in person in the studio
sure
with you
is.
today.
Sure is.
What a difference. So anyway, I've been getting to know you over the last couple weeks, and you have a fascinating background, and I'm particularly interested in sort of the pivot in your career. It seems like a pretty non-traditional entry into the wine business, and I'd love to hear a little about it.
Sure, sure. So I raised 3 kids, and as a second career, I went to law school and practiced law for 16 years. But during the course of that time, I started taking wine classes with a friend and really, really enjoyed it. And then at the law firm, I was asked to teach a class just for fun to a women's group, and taught the class sort of based on the thesis that I have ultimately incorporated into all of my classes. And then eventually decided that I wanted to stop practicing law and went full-time and created Venocity, and have been teaching classes and doing corporate events ever since. And so the thesis that I mentioned is really a combination of a traditional wine class or wine course, and also the fun that you have when you go to a vineyard with all of your friends. And so the idea is for people to have a lot of fun, but also to actually take away some good knowledge that they can use the next time they go to select a bottle of wine.
Wow, that's really interesting. You have been teaching sold-out classes for mainline school night, and like our whole organization, you had to pivot to Zoom during the pandemic. So I was really interested in your experience teaching wine, teaching about wine online, and how that contrasts to your experience teaching in person.
Yeah, it's different, that's for sure. I would say that it's good. I think the audiences have enjoyed it. I think the classes, the people who are coming have enjoyed it. However, it doesn't have quite the energy, as we all know, from the in-person experience, right? And so I'm anxious to get back to the in-person experience. But I mean, the technology's been fine. I have a presentation and I just share my screen like a lot of people are doing for work meetings and that kind of thing. And then people have their own wines that they buy that I either recommend or recommend general kinds of wines. And so they have those at home while I'm teaching the class about any particular type of wine. So you make adjustments, it's worked out, but there's nothing like the in-person experience,
and
that's for
are they
sure.
sharing about their experience in trying the wines during the class, both on Zoom as well as in person?
Yes, for sure, yes,
Yeah.
which makes it so much more interactive and so much more fun, right? And then people ask a lot of questions. I always enjoy getting a lot of questions from the class. Makes it that much more interesting.
Oh, that's great. So you'll enjoy all the questions I have for you today. So I have some random questions just about the industry in general, and then some more specific questions about your experience with mainline school night. So I've noticed that there's numbers on the shelves at wine stores, the ratings, so like 89, or I think that's a good rating.
Yes.
What do they mean, and are they, in your experience, are they indicative of the quality of the wine?
That's a good question. I think they're more indicative of the preferences of the tasters at whatever organization it is in a lot of ways. They're somewhat of an indication because if a wine is really unbalanced, if it really has not been made well at all, then it will not receive a high rating for sure. And even the ratings in the 80s are meant to be good wines. A lot of times people think that if it goes below 90, it means that there's something wrong with it, but that's not the case at all. Those ratings started a while back. Just as an idea. There are some people who are wine experts who don't really like the ratings because they think that it's a little bit unfair, and so they think for people to just rely on the rating doesn't really reflect what they themselves may prefer. So it really depends on who the evaluator is, what organization is the evaluator. But those ratings are done really in a very specific kind of environment as well. I mean, people sit without any other distractions and without any other music or people or anything going on around them, and then are really expert at tasting. And some of these tasters could taste 100 wines in a day. So it's really an expertise that's really interesting as well. But they frequently reflect the preferences, like I say, of the sort of what the organization is going for as far as what's good and what's a prize.
Do the tasters taste it and then spit it out?
Yes.
Into a spittoon?
Yes. Well, or a cup or whatever it might be, yes, because you really can't, after you've had a few tastes, the alcohol starts to affect your ability to really taste with any kind of precision. So
And is
they
there
definitely
any
spit.
kind of cleansing of the palate as they're tasting the 100 wines?
That's a good question. It would depend on the wines. I think typically what we like to do is we go from a lighter wine to a heavier wine. So if you're doing that, you're really not influencing from one to the next. So if you're tasting all white wines, let's say, typically you don't need to cleanse your palate in between at all. Now, if you're tasting sweet wines, like let's say a Sauterne or something like that, then you would want to readjust, let's say, your palate so that your brain is not expecting something super sweet and it gets hit with something that's normal, and now suddenly your brain interprets that as sour. Right? So something like that you would definitely need to take more care of.
That's really interesting. I was wondering if you've heard of a wine club called Wink. And so I think it's what I read, it started in 2012, and they're apparently shipping 1 million pours a month, which is pretty stunning, all of which it bottles itself, even when it comes from Argentina or Portugal. And I was wondering how they do that, and also if you know, and also what you think of that, and then what you think of other wine clubs, the concept of a wine club.
Of a wine club, sure. Well, there are different kinds of wine clubs. I have heard of Wink, although I'm not familiar with all of the details. However, it is interesting to note that a lot of wines around the world, believe it or not, are shipped in bulk, especially across borders, and then are bottled at the finish line, so to speak. Now, it could be very much under the instruction of the producer. Many producers bottle their own wines, and so I think, you know, if you go up the spectrum of price, the Bordeaux producers, let's say, they're bottling, for the most part, their higher end wines, they're bottling themselves and selling the bottles. But as you can imagine, it's very expensive to ship bottles. They're heavy. There's a lot of expense around that. And so many times there are producers, plenty of producers, nothing wrong with it, who are producing in a bulk container of some sort. And then the bottles are getting bottled at the location. That used to be very popular in England a long time ago, a few hundred years ago. Nothing surprising about that at all. So, what the most important thing are the grapes that are used to start the process, the quality of the grapes, the way the grapes are grown, where the vineyard is located, the kinds of grapes that they planted in that vineyard, that sort of thing. That's the very most important thing. And so then what happens after that, of course, is very important as well. But if you start with grapes that are not particularly high quality, then maybe you're going to do something, you know, you'll treat the wine a certain way afterwards.
And is there any correlation between price and quality of wine?
Great question. It's the age-old question. And so there have been lots of studies, scientific studies done by wine experts who, or with wine experts who are given, let's say, 6 bottles or 6 glasses of wine. They are asked to rate them according to what they think the price is, high to low, that sort of thing, and invariably they get it wrong. And so our brain plays funny tricks on us. So the best rule of thumb is to judge what you like, decide what you like, and go with that. But also, my advice always is to sort of expand your repertoire. And so ask someone you trust in a wine shop or the wine steward at a restaurant, if you're feeling adventurous at all, to say, you know, I really like this kind of wine, but I'm thinking of maybe stepping outside those lines a little bit. What would be something good that would be sort of close but still a little bit different, so I can see if I like that too. And so that always gives you more options. It's really a good way to do it. So price is not always the best indicator for that sort of an experimentation.
And I was also wondering about how you keep abreast of new wines and whether you travel in order to visit vineyards and sort of what your experience has been with that.
I always love to try a wine that I've never heard of before. So that's just always fun because there's so many different types of wines to try. And I do travel. I do the most recent, I'm trying to think, pre-pandemic was to Alsace, which was phenomenal, and went to, it was a shorter trip, it was near the holidays, so we really wanted to go to see the Christmas markets and that sort of thing. But we also went to a wonderful, wonderful vineyard, and it was a great experience. The people who own the vineyard really treated us to some beautiful wines. So that was a wonderful experience. And before that I was in Burgundy, also, of course, a phenomenal experience to visit with the winemakers and to the vineyard people. So it was great. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Even in the state store system, they seem to have gone over to being mostly wine. Is that just a phase, or is wine gaining in popularity?
Gosh, that's a good question. So you're thinking that there's more a higher percentage of bottles of wine versus
yes.
bottles of spirits?
Exactly.
I don't know the reason for that, to tell you the truth. I haven't asked them. But I think wine is gaining, it's always gaining in popularity in this country. You know, a long time ago, maybe 4 or 5 decades ago, was not nearly as popular. Beer was more popular, spirits were more popular, and then the wine industry really picked up, and it's just become more popular all the time. So I think there are more converts to trying wine all the time.
I was also interested in the containers of wine. So my husband and I used to have a wine cellar, and we used to collect wine. And back then, which was way back when, it was all about the cork and the bottle and that whole experience. And then there were screw tops, and then there were, I think, aseptically packaged wine in boxes, and then there's actually cans of wine now. So I was wondering, sort of, are those gimmicks? Is it about portability and accessibility? And how about the quality? How is the quality affected by how a wine is packaged?
Sure. So bottles are always going to be sort of for the higher end wines, I think will always be the preferred method of transport. And corks are a very historic method of closing a wine bottle, of a wine bottle closure. And so those are going to be maintained for a long time. There's no question about it, because winemakers also believe that corks lend a certain amount of aging capability to the wine. Whereas when you have a screw top, the wine is not going to really age much anymore. It's really an inert sort of system, whereas the cork allows a little bit of breathability into it, very tiny amount. But there's nothing wrong with a screw cap. Absolutely nothing wrong. It doesn't harm the wine. Almost every single bottle of wine on a store shelf is meant to be consumed the moment you take it home. So the closure is really not going to make a big difference for you unless you intend to keep the bottle for a really long time. I wouldn't recommend aging a bottle or keeping a bottle cellared that has a screw cap. Like, that's just not the point of it. And for bottles that are meant to be aged, you will know that because hopefully the people at the wine shop will tell you that, or there will be some sort of information about that. So screw caps are completely fine. As far as boxes and cans, I would say that we can pretty much assume that no one is putting their finest wine in a box or a can. But by the same token, they're so portable, right? If you're going hiking or something and you want to take wine with you, you don't have to take a wine opener. You don't, and bottles are so heavy. So a can is really more convenient, or a box, as long as you know that you're not getting, the finest wines in the world, but they're completely fine. And our brain can only handle so much, or our palate can only handle so much information coming into it, or so many, what's the word I want, but so many impacts on it. So if you're sitting on the beach, or if you're at the beach, a fine wine is probably not your best choice for sitting on the beach, only because you're not going to, there's so many other sensory impacts on you, the salt water, the salt air, all of the things that impact us, that it's fine to have just a regular, not particularly high-end wine at the beach. It's very appropriate, and you can chill them easily, and they're great.
That's great. Vicki, I wish we could spend more time together. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been wonderful.
We're so excited about the wine classes that you teach for Mainline School Night. I know you have one coming up in
I do.
July,
I think. There might be one in June, too. I can't remember.
Yeah,
I think so, yeah.
I think you have a few coming up. Are any on the porch?
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
They all are.
That's great. So it's nice to be together again and be outside. And thank you so much for joining us and for what you do for Mainline School Night.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we hope that you'll visit our website, mainlineschoolnight.org. We have so many classes to choose from, and we're adding classes all the time, including outdoor adventures, classes on the porch, and we will be back in person in the fall. So thank you. It was great to be with all of you today.